Hi, I just wanted to clarify some terms that were used above in this learning activity, specifically under the participial phrases section. So like I talked about in the previous video, it's not so important that you consciously know the names of all of these terms when we're talking about parts of sentences. There are really a lot, and on an everyday basis, you probably aren't going to use these terms. But what is important is to learn what the structure of a sentence is and start to learn what that internal rhythm of a sentence sounds like. There's a reason why you should put things in a particular order in a sentence. And one of the biggest reasons is to avoid awkward sounding sentences. So if sometimes you're reading over your work and the sentence sounds strange to you or clunky, it might be because some of these parts are in the wrong place. Like we talked about in the previous video, another problem that occurs when you're not using parts of sentences correctly or punctuating them correctly is these grammatical errors like sentence fragments, which we're going to talk about later in this learning activity. So let's start with this idea of participles, because again, this is a type of phrase that you'll probably use at some point in writing. So there's not a great definition of what a participle is, but really what it is adding some sort of ending to a word that is typically a verb, and doing that to slightly or drastically change the meaning of a term, okay? So this can happen in a couple of different ways. There are what are called present participles and past participles. And what it comes down to is this ending that you're adding to a word. So when you use a present participle, you're adding an ing ending to something. And that can be for a couple of different reasons. So let's look at the example at the top. You might add a present participle to change a verb in some way, like we have in this first example. And when you do that, you're adding an ing ending to a verb that contains a helping verb. So the example I have here, the student is writing her paper. We have this helping verb is, and then I've added this ing ending to the word write. And you might say, well, why would I use this specific phrase? In other words, why not just say the student writes her paper? Well, I think saying that is slightly different from this term is writing. Because when you say writes, it makes it sound like this is a thing that's happening now, and then it's going to stop sometime in the near future, right? When you say is writing, it emphasizes this activity as more of a process, right? Like it's a continual thing. And maybe it's going to go on longer than if we just say the student writes. And again, maybe this is like a, kind of trivial distinction, but it is a distinction, right? So again, this is something you might use to slightly change the meaning of a verb that you're using. Another way to use a present participle is to use this ing ending as a form of description or an adjective, right? So in this second example I have, a bird is a living organism. If I add that ing ending to the word live, now I'm changing that to this adjective that describes the organism, right? Living. So again, just a couple of ways you might use a present participle when you're writing. So underneath that, I have some examples of what are called past participles. So again, this is when you're adding some sort of ending to something that's typically a verb. But since it's past, instead of adding an ing ending, this is when you add an ed ending to make it more of a past tense form of a word, right? So sort of like the previous example, when you're adding this to a verb and changing the verb, you're going to use a helping verb. So in the first example, I have walked around my neighborhood. I used that helping verb have and then added this ed to the word walk, right? So like the previous example, again, you might ask, why would I just not use walked? I walked around my neighborhood. When you add that have in there, it makes it sound like more of a continual thing. Like I didn't just walk once around my neighborhood. This is an ongoing thing that I've done, right? A slightly different meaning. In the second example, sort of like the present participle, you can add this past participle ed ending to a word to turn it into an adjective or description, right? So processed food. It's describing the type of food that I'm talking about. But I also added another past participle in here, is considered. This is me kind of changing the verb again like I did in the sentence above it, right? So I added this helping verb is and added an ed ending to this verb consider, right? So again, we use these all the time. So it's pretty easy to identify whether you're using a participle if you see like an ing or an ed ending, right? And a participial phrase is going to be a group of words that contains a participle. Pretty simple. So let's talk a little bit about objects because those are mentioned in the description of participial phrases as well. So there are several different kinds of objects. And I guess what I should say is it's the easiest way to identify these things is being able to identify the subject and verb in a sentence. So like we've talked about, any sentence at the bare minimum needs to have a subject and a verb. And the subject is someone or something performing some action, and the action is going to be that verb, right? So realistically, when you write a sentence, there doesn't have to be an object in it. All you need is a subject and a verb. But most of the time, once you've included a subject and verb, there's going to be other stuff in that sentence that follows the verb. And, you know, we've talked about this before as well, but the verb plus any other stuff is what's called the predicate of the sentence, right? So contained in the predicate, you may have an object. So if there's any sort of noun or pronoun in your predicate, it's probably going to be some kind of object. So if you just have one thing or noun in your predicate after your verb, probably that's what's going to be called a direct object. And a direct object is going to be something that the subject is acting upon, right? So I gave a really simple example here under direct object. The boy kicked the ball. The boy is the subject. He's the one doing something. Kicked is the verb, this action that he did. And the ball is what the subject is acting upon, right? It's receiving this action. So again, in a really simple sentence like this, if you have any sort of noun following the verb, it's probably going to be a direct object. What gets a little bit trickier is when you have a couple of things in your sentence following the verb. So let's look at this next example. My neighbor gave me water. So my verb is gave, my neighbor is the subject, and then I have both a pronoun, me, and water, which is a noun, right? I have two things following the verb. So to figure out whether something is a direct object or an indirect object, typically you're just going to look at the order that those words are presented. So in this sentence, we have a direct object, water. Water is the thing that's being given by the neighbor, right? So what's that word me? We would call that the indirect object. An indirect object is basically who or what the direct object is for, right? So the water is the thing that's being given, but it's being given to me, right? So again, typically to figure this out, if you have a couple of objects in a sentence, the last one mentioned is probably going to be the direct object, the thing that's actually being acted upon. And any sort of object that comes before that is probably going to be an indirect object, who the direct object is for. Just to make this a little bit more complicated, you have what's called an object of a preposition. And like we talked about earlier in the learning activity, a preposition is going to be kind of like a placement word, like in or above or on or through, any of those sorts of words. So anytime you have a preposition connected to some object, a noun or a pronoun, we would call that the object of a preposition. So in this example that I give you, I actually have 3 types of objects here. So again, identify that subject, I, handed, which is the verb, and then we have all this stuff after the verb, right? I handed him the mail on the table. So again, if you see 2 objects, one right after the other, probably the second one is going to be your direct object, which is mail in this case. I handed mail. Who is it for? Him. That's the indirect object. And then we have this third object at the end of the sentence that's connected to this preposition on. So we would call the table the object of the preposition because it's connected to that preposition on, right? So again, it's thinking about the order of your, where you place things in a sentence, right? And it just takes some practice to identify this. So these last few descriptions all have to do with what are called modifiers. And the word modify, like typically we think of modify as meaning to change something, but when it comes to parts of speech, a modifier really means something that describes. And you might say, well, isn't that just an adjective, a word that describes? Well, a modifier can be an adjective, but it can also be a group of words that doesn't contain an adjective. If this group of words is being used to describe something in the sentence, it's considered a modifier. So let's look at a few examples here. So the first example, President Biden gave a long, informative speech. In this case, these adjectives long and informative are the modifiers because they're describing the speech, right? So this is a case where, yes, an adjective can be a modifier. But these second couple examples do not contain adjectives, but they're still modifiers. They're still describing something, right? So the actors spoke in unison. Unison is really a noun, but this is describing how they spoke, right? In unison means all together, right? So we're describing the way that they spoke. So this is a modifier. The man who would be king passed away, right? Using this phrase that includes who, it's describing the man, right? The man who would be king. Again, we don't have any adjectives in that exact phrase, but it is describing the man. So again, we use these things all the time. So this idea of complements, again, this has to do with modifiers. You can have what's called a subject complement, which is something that modifies the subject, or you can have an object complement, a phrase that modifies the object in a sentence, right? So when you have a subject complement, it's going to contain what's called a linking verb, a word like is, was, were, are, words like that. And it's going to be something that describes the subject of the sentence. So she is a good speaker. She is eloquent. These are describing this she, right? Whereas an object complement is going to modify or describe the object in a sentence. And really it's going to rename that object in some way. So the example is, critics called the movie a masterpiece. We found the movie enjoyable. So again, all this takes some practice and starting to identify what these words are doing.